Hello and welcome to this new panel in the Qatar Economic Forum on maximizing ESG in extracting industries. We have with us a panel today joining us from very different parts of the world that will talk to us about how investors, how consumers, mining, oil and gas companies have changed their views and their approaches to environmental and social and governance activities around the oil and gas and mining sectors. My name is Laura Milan. I'm a journalist at Bloomberg Green. And I would like to ask our speakers today our first question, which is how are extractive companies responding to shifts in investor thinking when it comes to ESG? I think maybe the first person I will call into talking is Julio Tamacas at Exxon. Julio, can you tell us a bit about what you've seen, what changes you have seen over the past few years, even over the past few months, when it comes on how investors think about ESG?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and thank you for giving me the chance to kick off the panel. So yeah, I mean, this is definitely an area that's become of higher importance to our investors, including large institutional investors, and it's been noticeable through many actions that have taken place over the last few months, that have been out on the news. But we have been very proactive in addressing this area, even ahead of some of the investors, voicing, concerns or issues. We have been very active in commercializing, a number of lower emission technologies in support of the goals of the Paris Agreement. We have focused extensive research and development portfolio on technologies that address what we call hard to decarbonize sectors of the economy that are responsible for about 80% of the energy related transmissions. In these areas are commercial transportation, power generation, and heavy industry. And to make it even more tangible, for everybody to see, we actually created a new business unit early this year. This business unit is called ExxonMobil Low Carbon Solutions. That's been tasked to commercialize low emission technologies. And the initial focus of this unit will be on carbon capture and storage, which we see as an important area, to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives.
How much of that has come from investor pressure or influence? What are investors telling you?
Yeah, and like I was mentioning before, a lot has come from our own view on how we see things, going, right. I mean, in parallel to that, we have had a lot of engagement with investors in this area, and these are, and the actions are not necessarily a response, but something that we have seen and that we want to be part of the overall solution. And hopefully it achieves the investors' objectives, for returns, and for continuing investing in a company that wants to be a player in the industry while achieving the global objectives of the Paris Agreement.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask pretty much the same question to Ariel Thomas, who heads a much different company, Lucara Diamond. So what have you seen on your end from investors? What are they telling you, and how has that changed over the past years and the past few months?
I think what's interesting about kind of the mining industry in general, and then I'll get maybe more specific about Lucara, but I think what's interesting is that, we've been on, I think, the journey around the E part of ESG and environmental performance for quite a long time. Although in recent years, the shift now is really to climate action and what are companies doing to really address this very fundamental issue. So that certainly has been something that we're all very aware of and focused on, and are working to working hard around that agenda. But I think also for us as a diamond mining company, what we've seen is a real shift towards the social piece, and the governance piece. And that's become paramount to investors. I think investors want to know that they're supporting responsible businesses that care about all of these aspects, but particularly for us right now, community engagement has been key, and just understanding supply chain and really being able to demonstrate transparency. Those have been some key issues. And most recently for Lucara, we're in the process of a big expansion. So we have gone out to the capital markets looking for additional supplemental financing. And so we are engaged with 5 large lending institutions. And I can tell you, it's quite remarkable how much time we have spent on ESG as part of that whole discussion. And that's not something we would have seen 10 years ago when we first started up our mind. So it's definitely front and center. Investors, want to know what we're doing in all of these areas, and they want to see real performance. This isn't just box checking. This is all about what is this company doing, and do they have a plan, and can they show tangible improvements year after year?
Mm-hmm. I want to turn now to Iris van der Vecken. What are you seeing in the whole sector? Is that just Lucara, or or other companies in the sector also kind of having the same experiences?
Well, Laura, I can very much agree with the comments of my colleagues, with Julia and Ira, because what we see is the time is now. There's really a momentum on ESG. And what is also important is it's the journey that matters, and companies have to show progress over time. And that brings me, of course, to the Responsible Jewelry Council, because we are on a journey. When we were founded in 2005 by 14 founding members, one of them was also mining house De Beers. And at this time, we have 1,400 companies spread over the full supply chain, but we also have 75% of the rough diamond production in our scope. And we see the key drivers for ESG, and I think some of them were already touched, is first of all, it is also this trust and this stakeholder confidence that's needed. So we see the consumer, the millennials and the Gen Z that really want to understand the values in action, and they're activists and they want to know about social purpose. We have, of course, the access to finance, the banks, the financial institutions, the investors who are pushing that agenda, and the evolving regulatory policy landscape. Because if you look at, for example, the upcoming EU regulation on human rights and environmental due diligence, it's really a trend that's shaping up. And I think there's also 4 trends we see in ESG is climate and energy efficiency, biodiversity, human rights due diligence. Ira was talking about this already. Companies are really looking at the different tiers and their supply chain. It's very complex, it takes time. Community development and relationships with a clear focus, Laura, on affected communities. So how do your products touch the lives, and how do they have positive impact? And then finally, data. We need reliable data. And I think that's also the good news, that companies are taking these metrics to show performance as part of management systems. So yeah, I think the time is now.
Mm-hmm. How about Dr. Tsuyoshi Abe? What are you seeing on your end? What's your take on this new trend?
Yeah. I think a new trend. As you all know, the investors is really the laser focus on our activities regarding to ESG. And Yokogawa, as I said, shifted focus on the non-hydrocarbon sectors to enhance the sustainability sectors, ensure sufficient people, resources, and influence at both the enterprise and operational level to build a momentum across the organizations. Then, integrating the SDGs 17 into the existing operation on economic, environmental, social, and governmental issues. Then we leverage SDG goal to set ambitious and progressive and measurable SDG action goals. So as a result, we are very honored, to get certification by Dow Jones Sustainable Index World Index last December. Is one of the benchmark. We are now recognizing to the one company to contribute the environment.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask now to the whole panel one single question, and then just let you all answer on your own time. So we've talked about ESG. I'd like to focus on the E on that acronym, so the environment. And ultimately, if companies want to do something for the environment, want to change something when it comes to the warming of the planet, they need to contribute by cutting emissions. And to do that, they need technology, and especially the companies represented in this panel. So I'd like to ask everyone here to pick one solution to either cut greenhouse gas emissions or capture carbon from the air. Just pick one solution that's your favorite, or the one that your company is focusing more on, or the one that you're investing on in the case of the investors, and just talk about it. And I'll leave the floor open to whoever wants to start.
Yeah, Laura, if you don't mind, I don't mind going first again on this question and following up on some of the comments that I was making before, because, one of the key areas, for us is carbon capture and storage, which we see as critical, to meet the objectives of a lower carbon future. And, agencies like the IEA and IPCC say the same thing. So we're spending a lot of effort in this area. We have been a leader in the area and want to do more. We see a great potential in being able to commercialize a lot of the efforts that we have seen, or a lot of the efforts that we have put into this area. We recently announced a big concept to commercialize this at a bigger level. It's a project in a concept for the Houston Ship Channel to basically develop a large-scale carbon capture and storage project that would significantly help decarbonize a heavy industry area in the Gulf Coast of the United States. When you see the activity that is happening there, and combined with the geological formations that you have that can safely sequester the carbon dioxide deep into the Gulf of Mexico, we see a great opportunity to put in place in a massive way something that we see as greatly helping the E part of the ESG, as you just mentioned. We can project, as an example, by this project, we can capture about 50 million metric tons of CO2 per year by 2030, and double that to 100 million by 2040. And that's the equivalent, more or less, of about, taking 20 million cars off the road. And as we progress, efforts like that, seeing what other places in the world, we can replicate that, that kind of project.
Thanks. Richard, do you want to go ahead and share your thoughts with us? What have you been seeing from your end?
Yeah, thanks, Laura, and thanks for inviting us on the panel. I think when we look at the metals and mining sector, by far the largest contribution of emissions is from the steel sector. So the mining groups, if you look at their what we call scope 3 emissions, most of the major mining groups, it's based on the fact that iron ore and coking coal is going into the steel making process. And we have existing technologies that can make significant differences to those emissions. So we're going to make a material impact on emissions. And Standard Chartered, most of our large clients are in Asia in terms of the steel groups that link in with our sort of large diversified major clients. What we need to see is a transition happening as they move away from the blast furnace. And that's quite a challenge for them at the moment. And I think interesting what Julia was saying about carbon capture, that's obviously a newer technology that's coming in, which can retrofit existing blast furnace facilities. But I think what we're going to see is a very significant change, a move towards electric arc furnaces, particularly in Europe to start with. And then over time, we're going to see more of those in places like China. But I think from a technology perspective, we already have much of the technology there to make at least the initial steps of a journey towards net zero. But ultimately, if we are going to hit our targets by sort of 2050, for example, Baowu, now the largest steel company in the world, has put out targets to make itself net zero by 2050, we're going to need to see a move towards green hydrogen. So I'm not going to go into that in detail today, but I think in the next 10 to 15 years, there's actually significant changes that can be made through a move towards electric arc furnaces and scrap steel. And then potentially we can talk a bit later about the transformation potentially of the iron product and how that's going to be produced, and sort of the potential for that product to be enhanced before it goes into the steel making process.
That's great. Julian, why don't you tell us a bit about your favorite technology, your favorite solution, or the one that you have in mind when you think, this is a good way to cut emissions to carbon capture, carbon.
And thank you for inviting me on the panel. I would just concur with Richard that decarbonisation of the process is an important step. But if we take a step back from that, the biggest challenge is the power supply sector, because if we take steel decarbonisation, the ultimate solution there is, as Richard said, is initially is EAFs. Ultimately, it's hydrogen. In order to generate green hydrogen, you need green energy. There's a question mark around whether there's enough of the catalyzer materials to produce the green hydrogen, but that's perhaps for a different discussion. So it's the energy supply sector that needs to green. It also has implications for the aluminium space, because obviously, again, we can go down the route of increased scrap collection and use to truly transform. The supply side on scrap will require policy and societal change, and that's not going to be quick. So aluminium and steel are very, very similar. Steel's the single largest contributor. The aluminium side of the equation contributes around about 2.5% of total global emissions. You can decarbonise by going down the scrap route, but that will only take you so far. Then really you're looking at decarbonising the power supply sector. That's perhaps where carbon capture comes in, because if we think about the bifurcation in the world, we're going to have decline in the West for coal-fired generation. We're still going to see growth in the East. Maybe carbon capture helps resolve that as an interim solution. So I would say decarbonisation but very much predicated on the availability of green energy, which I might add is going to require a huge amount of metal, which needs to be green. So it's a new circularity.
Yeah, and we'll talk about about that in just a moment. Dr. Abe, I think you wanted to address the panel as well.
Yeah, I love technology, so let me talk about the technology a little bit. So I suppose there are a couple of the promising technology that can be deploying the carbon capture and the CO2 emission reductions. For instance, there are the methanation, the green hydrogen, and the green ammonia, and so on. Of course, blue hydrogen is also the promising one by technology of the carbon capture, use, and storage. As talking about blue versus green, the cost of green one is still higher than blue up until now. However, I guess the cost of green hydrogen and ammonia will fall down dramatically from now on, as well as solar power cost have fell down exponentially in the past 1 decade. And in the medium term, one more new technology is expected to contribute carbon neutral. It is a biology technology. For instance, it is microbial degradations. Meanwhile, so new technology will be able to enable to use the ability of the tree, it's a wood, in the maximum. It is cellulose nanofiber, lignin, to produce the new material. So Yokogawa, has commenced the sales of the 100% plant-derived, sulfated cellulose nanofibers. We will strive to promote the widespread use of the plant-derived material that will lessen our dependence on the fossil resources and contribute to the realization of the carbon neutral society. So one more bio-derived technology is microalgae. To use here, microalgae is also the promising technology. We will be able to use the microalgae to produce protein, cosmetic, the fertilizer, and the biostimulant forever on behalf of the product derived from the petrochemicals. So the day they come true will not be so long, I think.
I would like to ask now, Era, so what changes are you implementing or would you like to implement in the company's minds in Botswana and elsewhere to cut emissions and reduce the environmental footprint?
Sure, and maybe I'll switch gears a bit. I think what we've been talking about are really important large-scale initiatives which are going to be critical to moving the dial on a global scale. But I think it's also important to remember that for the smaller businesses that are out there, driving efficiencies in every aspect of your business can be hugely impactful. And so for us, we are on a decarbonization journey. We live and work in the country of Botswana, which has huge solar opportunity, which to date has not been developed for largely regulatory reasons. So we are working closely with the government, who's got an ambitious agenda around GHG reduction, to look at ways and means where we can introduce more solar into our operation. And if you think about mining operations and industrial operations, we need base load power to drive shafts and heavy equipment. But what we can do is integrate a lot more solar that can be then sold into the community grid as a way to really reduce our impact. So that's something that we're very focused on right now, and developing a plan around reducing our overall footprint that way. But I think one of the other things that Lucara is really well known for is our approach to innovation and our incorporation of new technologies. And we have also looked within the supply chain, and I'm sure Iris will talk about this more in a moment. We are a proud member of the Responsible Jewelry Council. And one of the things that we look at closely is what we can do within our supply chain. And what we've really observed over the last 100 years in our business is the way we sell diamonds really hasn't changed. And it's not very efficient. It's pretty inflexible. And what we would note is that diamonds that are sold really involve people getting on planes and traveling around the world to different destinations to visually inspect those diamonds, purchase them, take them back to a polishing factory. And then at the end of the day, many of the diamonds they've just purchased will then get retraded. So you can have a diamond basically produced in Botswana that will change hands as many as 12 times before it lands on a polishing wheel and ultimately makes it into a piece of jewelry and onto a store shelf. So we developed a technology a few years ago that really turns that push style sales system, which is quite antiquated, on its head and turns it into a pull style sales system where we're actually using a matching algorithm or technology to take each diamond as it's mined, each and every day at on site in Botswana. We scan that diamond and we upload that to a secure web-based server. And then we have a matching algorithm that finds specific demand for that diamond in polished form anywhere in the world, so that transaction happens virtually and that diamond gets delivered in one step. So that's just a small example of what we're doing, but we think over time these small opportunities, seemingly small opportunities, actually can be quite impactful on a larger scale as well.
Thanks, absolutely. And I'll pick on one of the comments you've made about the supply chains and the supply chain and turn it to Iris. So what are you seeing there? What are other companies in the sector doing to improve that part of their operations?
Well, Laura, we see, of course, that the whole industry is on this movement, on this journey of decarbonization, and that takes time. And you will see, of course, that companies are at different stages of maturity. So, we have the biggest players. When you think about the bears, Alrosa, Rio Tinto, if you think about Lucara, they're very advanced. But I think the good news is they're cascading their best practices into the supply chain. And there we as an industry, as the RJC, see an enormous role in educating and also sharing best practices. And I do want to share one example, which I like, and I invite you to look at it from the Beers Group, which is currently working with leading academics on researching the potential to store large volumes of carbon in processed kimberlite through mineral carbonization in Canada. And kimberlite is the host rock for diamonds. So, I mean, these are new innovations, and I think it will have a ripple effect on the industry. And same with Alrosa. So I think that our role as the RJC is really to bring up every company to the next level, because we will only get a real, truly sustainable supply chain if this is an inclusive supply chain. And that means is that the smaller enterprises need to be participating in that, and that requires much more education. And I think also cross-learning, like I heard from my colleagues here on innovation and technology.
This is great, because I think we've touched absolutely every part of any company's operation and almost of the economy. So we've talked about supply chains, about power demand, about new technologies like green hydrogen or carbon capture. Many things, I think we can all agree on that, will change over the next few years. So I would like to ask you to do an exercise of imagination and think what the world is going to look like in 10, 20 years' time. What would you like to see, and what do you think the sectors and the companies you're focused on will look like in the future, in a few years' time? I'll leave it open to the floor, see who wants to answer first. Richard?
Yeah, Laura, let me start by maybe not directly answering that question, but it maybe it can trigger some other comments from others. But I wanted to add a little bit more from some of the comments from people like Julian and Dr. Rob and some of the other panelists. One of the important items that we have to realize as well, and I think Julian touched on this, is that much of the power generation, is still done by coal. So even with things that are existing and maybe do not get that much press, and especially I want to call it out, given that this is a Qatar Economic Forum, that natural gas, liquefied natural gas, plays a critical role in helping reduce emissions, because it displaces a lot of our coal power, switches a lot of our coal power, and that helps reduce emissions significantly. So we're very proud of partnering with Qatar in producing, LNG that enables that, and you combine that with some of the other things that were happening, and that is what's leading you to kind of significantly be able to reduce emissions over the next few years.
Maybe I can say a few words. So I think as we look to the future, we're going to need some very radical transition here in terms of to make a difference. And I started to talk a little bit about the sort of need to produce different sort of inputs into the steel process. And I think what we do see is the potential for a number of regions close to very cheap power sources, renewable power sources, becoming the hubs for the production of metallics. So, potentially using green hydrogen and basically renewable power to produce iron and steel and aluminium, potentially also linking to hydropower. And I think what we've seen, one of the big differentiators for China is the fact that it's continuing to expand its nuclear power industry. And again, that can be part of the solution for green hydrogen and the production of lower carbon or pretty much zero carbon sort of steel. So I think the opening up of certain regions which are going to be linked to cheap power, potentially Western Australia, the Middle East, potentially parts of China, we could see it, and also Africa with the renewable power, with solar. We could see some very significant hubs where metal is produced in a more refined and further downstream form, and effectively we see an offshoring of steel and other metal production away from the current locations, which are nearer to the customer. I think the second theme is around battery materials hubs. So basically, grouping of companies that are producing the feedstock for the battery revolution. We've seen that to a certain extent happening in Indonesia. I think we're going to see it in Finland. We're going to see it probably in the US and other parts of the world. But I think there's these agglomerations of companies around metals, sharing cheaper electricity, high quality materials, and providing a secure supply chains with an ESG sort of friendly banner. I think Indonesia, I think the jury's out on whether it's going to make that transition. And I think we are going to see quite significant amounts of backward integration, like we saw 12 years ago, where the steel industry was buying iron ore mines and buying stakes in iron ore companies for offtake. I think what we've seen recently is an upticking of groups like POSCO that are transitioning to battery materials, taking stakes in nickel groups like First Quantum's Ravensthorpe mine, and using that to effectively secure supply into that supply chain that they're building, and that those the battery material hubs that are popping up in parts of the world. So I think those are probably two of the areas that we see, fundamental change potentially in the next 10 to 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Abe, I saw you were smiling a couple of times while Richard was talking. Do you want to share your thoughts about the future that awaits us?
Okay, thank you for asking that. So the talking about the futures, I think looking at the world today, so everything is increasingly interconnected in complex ways. It becomes ever more important to capitalize on the interconnectedness by engaging in the co-creation. So to provide value based on the system of systems, it's a SOS concept. So I think it's a very valuable for the not only the mining industry and all other extractive sectors. So we are going to pursue and realize to make the current plant automation to shift to the autonomy and also the smart manufacturing initiative. So we will create value by effectively promoting the connectivity and overall optimization driven by integration, autonomy, and digitalization under the digital transformation umbrella. So we say this is an activity regarding to symbiosis economy. So symbiosis, it's a kind of the ecosystem. So multi-industry collaborate together to reduce emission.
Mm-hmm. I would like, thanks, Dr. Abe. I would like to ask Ira, you've mentioned, and Richard has mentioned, to the potential for solar power in Africa, and in your, specifically in Lucara's mine in Botswana. I'd like to ask you, how does that look in a few years' time? Are we talking about a mine fully powered by renewable energy? Are we talking about mining trucks that can run on hydrogen, for example, that's also powered by renewable energy? What are you seeing there? What would you like to see?
Listen, I think it's moving fast, and I think all of that is possible. I mean, I agree with Richard's comments in the sense that it's going to be about a mix. And it's going to be about, driving that sort of global objective collectively. And, we're excited about the opportunities that we've identified right now, but I'm very confident that there's going to be more opportunities identified tomorrow. And I think that that's what we all have to remember. The technology and the innovation is moving quickly. I think it's tremendously exciting for the mining industry. As we've talked about, the mining industry needs to provide a lot of these critical metals and materials to really fuel the energy transformation. So I think going to be really interesting days ahead. I think for Botswana specifically, solar is the most immediate and obvious opportunity that has not been really exploited. And so we are looking forward to tackling that with the government. And, are we going to be a mine entirely run on solar? No, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that, we do need base load power, and we're not quite there yet with that technology, but it is happening. And I think with, the hydrogen revolution that Richard and Julian have been talking about, all of these pieces will come together, I think, and be part of the solution. And I think we have a very engaged community, not only our local stakeholders and communities of interest, but our investors and our financiers. So I think there is a strong will to continue to make progress, and so we remain, quite excited about it.
That's great to hear. I would like to ask now, Julian before has referred to the availability of metals and materials that will power and that will fuel this transition. So I'd like to ask you, Julian, what do you think about that? Do you think there will be enough? We are already seeing increases in prices recently in copper, for example, steel and so on, as demand increases, and we're expected to see even more demand for these materials as electric vehicles take off and as new renewable power plants are built all over the world. So is there enough of the materials that we need to power that transition?
I'd say, with the exception of cobalt, there is enough that is available to be developed. The key question is whether it will get developed in a timely manner. And just to frame the scale of the challenge, at Wood Mackenzie, we've done some analysis looking at what it would take to deliver a 2-degree pathway. And put simply, you would need to double the size of the aluminium and the copper industry globally to achieve that pathway. You need to increase the nickel industry by a factor of 1.3, and cobalt and lithium would have to increase by a factor of 5 or 6. Now, patently, that's going to take a huge amount of capital. It's going to take more time than we have to achieve the 2-degree pathway. That isn't to say that it can't be achieved. So the industry has a challenge, because miners have managed to hook their investors on the dividend drug. And there's a choice. You're either distributing dividend or you're investing in growth. And at the moment, the choice is dividend. At some point, investors need to move into allowing their boards to invest in growth. Now, it will come, it has to come, because if it doesn't, what will happen is many of the commodities that everyone is assuming will deliver the energy transition will be designed out. So, for example, cobalt, we're already seeing cobalt thrifting and the desire to design out cobalt, partly around risk, but also around availability of supply. So I believe there's almost 2 phases to this energy transition. There's the initial phase, and as Julia said, you'll see gas forming a significant part of the initial phase, 1/3 lower carbon emissions compared to coal, so a very strong transient fuel. We have a focus on battery raw materials and the battery economy. But from 2030 onwards, the hydrogen economy will start to take off. And I think we'll end up with the choice between batteries and hydrogen, which would be quite an interesting development.
That's great. I'd like to, since you've referred to Julio's comment from before, Julio, I'd like to get your thoughts on hydrogen as well. And from now on, I will ask all of you to be quick, because we've got 6 minutes left. And so if you're a bit quick, we'll just be able to hear from all of the panelists before we have to wrap up.
Yeah, so it's good to hear all these comments about the mix that it's going to take for a number of things and how important hydrogen can be. I just wanted to say that hydrogen right now it's a very small portion of the energy system around the world, and it's got great potential to be one of those things to help us achieve significant reductions in the future. much greater than what it is right now. And we are spending a lot of research and development in this area, because it's an area that we see, as you hear from the panelists, that has a lot of promise to help achieve the objectives of a lower carbon future.
Mm-hmm. There's an aspect of this whole change, this whole revolution that we haven't mentioned. And so very quickly before we finish, I'd like to turn to Richard to ask him about government and the role that governments are playing in this, because obviously green stimulus and even the encouragement and the legal assurance that they're giving to companies that want to invest in this is important. So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Just very briefly. So I think the role of government is fundamental. I think everyone's focused on this globally, with COP26 coming up later this year. I think a lot of us are working in different panels around getting prepared for that, trying to lobby and push the agendas around the decarbonisation agenda in particular, but obviously the broader ESG area as well. I think I think one of the areas that we're taking an active role in is basically the development of a voluntary carbon market, and Bill Winters, our CEO, is sort of the chairman of this, along with Mark Carney, looking at how we price carbon and how effectively by pricing carbon and using that as a potential both stick and carrot to move businesses quicker towards transition. So I think governments play a role, and we as banks and investors and other groups can also play a role to move it in the right direction. I think one other point, just slightly adjunct to this, is China. Julian mentioned about the lack of growth coming from many of the Western companies. I think China, as the one group with the government support, is able to push through change and move quickly around some of this transition areas. So in terms of the move towards developing more resources, we've seen it in Indonesia with nickel, and I think we're going to see it even further with copper in Africa and cobalt. So I think governments can make a very big difference here, and I think involving them and getting them on side is crucial to this sort of transition that we need.
I'd like to ask the member of the panel who actually runs a mining company, even if it's diamonds, but Era, what's your take on this?
Sorry, my Alexa is just talking in the background there. I apologize. I wanted to make a comment earlier, and Richard kind of covered it off somewhat. Julian made a comment on companies making decisions to invest in growth versus dividends. I think we also have to look at the regulatory environment in many of the countries in which these metals are one, geologically prospective, and two, being developed as a result. I mean, it is a challenge to get these ore bodies through discovery, permitting, and ultimately into development. So I think that needs to be really examined carefully, because this doesn't happen quickly. It's not easy to just turn on the taps. But overall, Laura, maybe I'll just end off by saying that, and maybe it's a reiteration of the comment, it's going to be important to think about the energy mix, and to be open-minded to change, and to be working collectively, around the world to identify the best opportunities and to move those forward as part of a broader global ambition. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. And I'd like to turn to Iris now for some final and hopefully quick comments on the future and what awaits us. Again, we've talked a lot about that in this panel, but would like to hear your thoughts before we end.
Well, the future, this is now, and we call it with the 2030 agenda, which Dr. Abbey was speaking about, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, is a shared responsibility. We all, as industry, as government, have a huge responsibility. And I think, we see the future with the mining houses quite optimistic, because we see that strong leadership, and it will require collective action, as we said. And also the Responsible Jury Council is very committed to this agenda. And I also invite you to look at the work we're doing on our SDG task force in educating the industry to get everyone along the journey on understanding what is innovation and technology what is right due diligence, etc. So yeah, together we can do this.
That's a great thought to end. Thanks so much for everyone for participating in this panel. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon.